Hello, everyone, and welcome to PSAT Prep Live. I'm Kaplan instructor Stephanie. It is my absolute pleasure to have you with me here today. Joining me are my fabulous Kaplan colleagues and experts in their own right. You've got Boris, we've got Beth, Crystal, Michael, Rob, all here are with you to just bring you PSAT success as we head on into test day, which for many of you is right around the corner. In this lesson, we are going to be talking first about the Kaplan methods for linear equations. But before we do that, let's take a little bit of a look at what the PSAT is all about. Now, the PSAT is going to be standardized. This means that it's the same structure that you're going to see every single time you take it. The very first section you're going to see is the reading test, and this is going to account for the first full hour of the PSAT. This is going to have 47 questions, and in future sessions of PSAT Prep Live, we'll be delving into what we're going to look at and what you can look at to strategize your way through the reading comprehension section. After that, there's always going to be a 35-minute writing and language test. Now, this is going to be 44 questions long, and it's looking at things like English grammar, composition, as well as passage organization and structure. And then after that, you're going to have that 70-minute math section. And this is really what we're going to be delving in during today's first session. Now, this 70-minute math is going to include both calculator and non-calculator components, and it largely focuses on algebra, although you will see questions that do delve into some other topics like geometry, as well as some of the basic trigonometry for those of you who may have taken a pre-calc or trig class. This gives you a total of 165 minutes. So the PSAT is just shy of 3 hours long. Now, I know in our poll, we asked, which test are you later going to take? And I saw quite a few of you were thinking about taking the SAT later on in your college admissions careers. Well, the PSAT is a little bit shorter than that, but it is fantastic practice, and it does contain the exact same sessions. Now, this is 137 multiple choice questions, although as you will have seen for those of you who may have taken the PSAT before, you're also going to get something that we call grid-in questions. And these are specific to the math section. We might think of these as short answer or fill in the blank type questions. And collectively, you're going to get a score that breaks down into two components. You have a math and you have a writing and evidence-based reading and writing section. Now, given that even though we have 3 basic tests, but we see you're only going to get 2 scores, let's do a quick math question to prepare us for the material today. Go ahead and tell me in the chat. You can see that right to the right here. This means that math is going to account for what percentage of your overall PSAT score? Yeah, what a good question to get us started off today. So we see, 50% of your score is going to come from math. So people like Hans, if math is the bane of your existence, first off, take heart. Even though it's a very large component, half of your PSAT score, it doesn't mean that this has to be some insurmountable obstacle because you have a lot of resources at your disposal. And again, in addition to our live sessions, you also, and we'll talk about this later at the end, but I want you to make use of all of your PSAT Prep Live resources, including those that are found there on the website. So let's take a look at how the PSAT is scored. First off, and this is great news, there is no wrong answer penalty. Just knowing this one fact alone is going to allow you to already be strategic in terms of how you approach the PSAT. Tell me in the chat, the fact that you don't get any deductions for a wrong answer means that you should do what for every question that you see on the test? Or, I guess, if you don't know the answer to a question on the test, what should you do? Yeah, you should never leave a question blank. What this means is that, of course, if you know the right answer, definitely go ahead, bubble it in. But it also means that if you don't know the correct answer, you don't know how to solve the problem, or potentially you're just running out of time, you should always bubble something in. You should definitely guess, as War says, always guess rather than leave a question blank. Now, in terms of your score, we already talked that math is 50%, and that means that evidence-based reading and writing is going to be that other 50% of your score. Those are going to be scaled from 160 to 760. Now, you may be wondering, that's a bit of an odd number. Well, technically, I guess it'd be an even number, but it's a bit of a strange number to have the score out of. And the reason that this is out of 760 is because your PSAT scores align directly with the projected SAT score. Now, the SAT score is out of 800. The difference here is that the PSAT doesn't quite have the same level of high difficulty questions, or at least not as many of them, as the SAT does. So it's scaled back just slightly. Now, in addition to this, you're also going to get 3 scores for each of the tests: reading, writing and language, and math. This can be very useful for you, particularly if you're looking at your evidence-based reading and writing and you're not certain, should I focus on the reading? Should I focus on the writing and language? Should I focus on both? These scaled scores out of 40 will help you figure out how that evidence-based reading and writing breaks down in a way that just your score out of 760 wouldn't. All right, so you add these 2 scores up and you're going to get a total score out of 320 to 1520. So again, what this means is that if you answered everything correctly, let's say you rocked the PSAT, right? That's what we're here to do. You still only get a score out of 1520. And this would then scale up to a 1520 on the SAT. Those last few 80 points, for those of you who are looking to use your PSAT score as a springboard to SAT success, again, there's going to be a few additional higher difficulty questions there that you'd see you're just not going to see on the PSAT. And so that's why this is only out of 1520. Right. You're also going to see the percentile ranking. And for those of you who are particularly interested in using the PSAT as a national merits qualifying test, what the percentile ranking is telling you, it's not the percentage of how many questions you got correct versus how many questions you didn't. Rather, this is ranking you against all other juniors who took the test at the same time that you did. So you'll never be able to score in the 100th percentile because you can never do better than yourself. Well, at least you can never do better than yourself at any given point. You can definitely do better than yourself on previous attempts. In fact, you all know that. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here practicing and preparing. So this is going to give you the percentage of how many students who scored less than or equal to you. That is what your percentile ranking is going to take a look at. And as I mentioned, the PSAT is also known as the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. For those of you who are looking to achieve national merit, this test is going to evaluate you based on other students within your state. So even though the scholarship is called national merit, you're really competing against other students in your state to get one of the top 1,000 PSAT scores compared to other test takers, in fact, other juniors. For those of you who may be taking the PSAT as a sophomore or younger, you're absolutely welcome to take the PSAT for great practice, but you'll only qualify for national merit if you take it your junior year. So a little bit of a primer in terms of what the PSAT is and how the PSAT can be used. Let's delve into what we're really here for today, which is to talk about PSAT equations and word problems. This is an enormous part of the algebra questions that you're going to see on the math section of the test. So let's take a look at some of our objectives. And I hope you're sensing a theme here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Kaplan method to heart of algebra questions. We always have to have a process. Then we're going to talk about some of the content. We're going to look at linear equations as well as 2 variable systems of linear equations, both how to solve them. We'll then look at how to approach them in terms of a graphical form. And then we're going to derive our own equations by translating word problems into those linear systems that we earlier discussed how to solve. So linear equations is the name of the game. Let's take a look at our Kaplan method for math. I want you to tell me in the chat, when you see a question on the math section, what is the very first thing that you do? You see a question. A lot of you are probably going to say, well, I'm going to read that question. Yeah, exactly. The first thing you want to do is, of course, read the question, but sometimes you have these big, heavy, dense passages, almost like mini novels that are presented to you in some of those story problems. In your experience, how much of that giant, dense, text-heavy word problem did you really need in order to figure out what to do on any particular question? I'm sure a lot of you are saying, a lot of the times there's just a lot of fluff. There's just a lot of extra information, distracting information. So the first thing I want to do here is we're reading the question, but more importantly, we want to identify what the question is asking us. Sometimes this is very straightforward. Sometimes you have a question that says equals question mark, and you're simplifying it. And sometimes you're solving for X, and sometimes you're solving for Y. But other times you're given just, like I said, this huge chunk of text, and we want to just go right to the most important part. First thing you want to do is just identify what that question is asking. That's going to allow you to do the second part of our step here, which is to organize the information that you have at your disposal. So now we know what we're looking to find. Now we look at what we have. And the next thing we're going to do is put together a plan. Now, step 2 says choose the best strategy. Best can be a little bit of a subjective term, but I want you to tell me in the chat, when we're talking about the best strategy on test day, what makes one strategy better than another? Well, we know a couple of things. The goal of the PSAT, we want to get the questions correct. Most importantly, we want to get them correct. Accuracy matters. However, accuracy is not the only thing that's going to turn us into a PSAT rock star. We also need to make sure that we have, as Diane says, the shortest method. Yes, what we're looking for is the most efficient and effective way to answer the question. So this is going to differ for many of you. Remember, this is the best strategy for you, the fastest method for you. So we're going to talk about some of the overall fastest methods, but that means on test day, if you see a way that you are very comfortable with and you are really efficient at it, and it is the fastest way for you to solve a problem, that is going to be your best method. The big idea here, though, is what I want you to think about between identifying what the question is and between just doing math. Notice how we stop to say, how am I going to answer this question? Put together a plan of action. You don't have to plan out your step-by-step approach, but you do need to have a sense of, here's where I am, here's where I need to go, here's generally how I'm going to get between points A and B. It would be like getting in the car and just like, you don't really know where you're going, you're just driving places. Not a very efficient way to do it. So we don't want to just jump in and start doing math on autopilot. We want to make sure we actually have a clear destination in mind and at least an approximation of the route we're going to take. Finally, we're going to check that we answered the right question. This is such an important step. I'm in fact going to put a big star by it because time and time again, I cannot tell you how many times I've seen students do some really great math, but then they don't end up getting the question right. So when I say check that you answered the right question, what does this mean? I mean, we already identified the question. How could we possibly answer the wrong question? Some of you might be thinking, well, we need to make sure that we bubble it in to the right spot in our answer grid. And that's true. You do need to be attentive to that. What we're talking about here is to make sure you've actually answered what the question desired. So if the question asked you to solve for X, don't solve for Y. If the question wanted 2X, don't solve for X, or don't bubble in X. Make sure that you actually take it that extra step and answer 2X. So we always want to go back and say, all right, I have found something. I've done some math. Did I find what the question wanted? You can go back to what you underlined in step 1, check it, and hey, if you have, good job, you're ready to go. And if not, well, then you've now caught yourself and given yourself that opportunity to go and make some corrections. So let's put this into practice here with question number 1. As a reminder, you do have that poll located below the slide here, so please put your answers there in the poll. We want to keep the chat spoiler-free. We don't need hashtag spoiler alerts. Let's give everyone the opportunity to think this one through. So if we're following our Kaplan method, we see that the first thing we want to do is identify the question. And here our question is in fact fairly straightforward. We want to know, what is x? Okay, fantastic. Now, if I take a look at what I'm given here, I see a couple of different ways I could approach this problem. But I want to think about the best strategy or the most efficient. Tell me in the chat, what is going to be the most efficient way to simplify this expression? And again, we've got a couple of different ways to do it. One way we could do it would be, well, we could just start jumping in and mathing on autopilot, and we could distribute the 1/2 between everything. But what is somewhat less efficient about multiplying and distributing all these fractions across my binomial? Well, I haven't made life easier for myself. I've in fact made life harder for myself. Now I don't only have one fraction, now I've got 3 halves, 17 halves, 8/6. Oh my gosh, this is getting harder. Like, this is escalating quickly. I like what David and Justin are saying. Let's clear the fractions, and we can do this by multiplying by 6, by that least common multiple or common denominator. By doing that, we're going to get rid of all the fractions. And particularly since this could very well be a non-calculator question, this now has turned our numbers into much, much nicer integers. Now I can go ahead and I can distribute the 3 across 3x and 17. And I can, of course, just remove the parentheses on the other side. At this point, I have a linear equation. We're just going to go ahead now and combine our like terms. So let's go ahead and subtract 8x from both sides. Let's subtract a negative 51 from both sides. Let's be careful not to make a sign error as we subtract that 51 from negative 10. And I get x equals negative 61. Now, I'm looking at the poll, and we are pretty darn confident that answer A is our answer. But what's one last thing I'd want to check for before I bubbled in answer A on test day? I would want to make sure that I followed all 3 steps of that Kaplan method. I would want to say, all right, I wanted x. I got x. There we go. Going with answer choice A. Now, answer choice C was also fairly tempting. And again, we had this negative sign right here. When we had to subtract this negative 51, we want to make sure that we're subtracting negative 10 minus 51 when we move that integer over to the other side. If we added 51 to both sides, we'd end up with trap answer C. So be careful anytime you're dealing with those negative numbers. If you're finding yourself making these arithmetic mistakes frequently, that's something to take note of, and just say, self, always double check anytime I might have a negative number, because as you've seen, those are some of the potential pitfalls that will be awaiting you on test day. Let's take a look at another one here. So a similar type of question. This time we want to know the approximate value of x. And we've got fractions once more. This time our fractions are inside the parentheses. So let's think what's going to make our life easier. And I liked what we did on that last question. I want you to tell me in the chat, what could we multiply by this time that is going to simplify life for us? Clear those fractions out of the way. And this time we don't have to worry about what's over here. We have a 1 in the denominator in essence. So we can just multiply everything by 7. 7 is going to clear the first fraction. And we just want to make sure, we want to triple check that we haven't forgot about multiplying this 7 all the way across. So we want to make sure we also multiply 4 times 7. Otherwise, we're going to have an off-balance equation because we'll have multiplied one thing but not the other. Now I'm going to stop right here for a second because our answer choices are their information. When we say organize the information you have, answer choices are included. What do you notice is different about our answer choices in this question compared to our answer choices in the question that we just looked at? So yeah, last time we had a lot of integer values. This time we have decimals. What does that tell you that you can do on a question like this if you notice that all your answer choices are in decimal form? Should you keep chugging along with 101 over 220 and 8 over 9, and let's try to distribute this 808 over 220? No, we don't want to do that. Again, the name of the game here is to make life simpler for ourselves. So since we know that this is a decimal question, this is likely to be a calculator question. So let's go ahead and turn those fractions into decimals. Now we've simplified this so that it's more calculator ready. Now we'll distribute the 8 across. Now we'll distribute 28 across. And once more, we're left with a linear equation. We can go ahead and combine like terms. When we do so, we're going to get 38x equals 244.76. Divide both sides. Remember, our golden rule of equations, do unto one side as you would do unto the other side. Dividing both sides by 6, we're going to get 6.8. Once more, we want to follow that Kaplan method. I solve for x. Is x what I wanted? Yes, I wanted x. And we can go ahead and bubble answer choice D. Now, for these types of questions, notice it asks us about the approximate value. We want to be careful that we don't round too early. So with these types of questions, we can either keep them in fractions all the way to the end, or as we did here, we can keep our decimal places out to at least 2 points. And the reason we want to keep these out to at least 2 decimal points, notice how our answer choices also had decimals out to, as a minimum, some of these had, at maximum, 2 decimal places. So there was the possibility that we might have had a 2 decimal place answer there. So by rounding only at the end, we'll be able to make sure that we don't kind of misround or round down a little bit. Okay, nice work on these. Let's talk now about how we can put these linear equations into graph form. I want you to tell me in the chat, when we're talking about a line, what is the general equation for a line? Because honestly, if you got this, you've got like a super rock solid foundation for every single one of these linear equation questions that we are going to be taking a look at. So when we're talking about a line, we're talking about our good old friend y equals mx plus b. So let's talk about each of those components. Let's first talk about m. So our slope is the rate of change. Now, this is a very important classification here. Rate of change. A slope is a rate, particularly when you see word problems that ask you for rates, or they've given you a graph and they're asking you about a rate. That is asking you for the slope. The slope is a rate of change. And we have a couple of different ways of thinking about slope. Tell me in the chat, what is your favorite way of thinking about slope? Because there's a lot of different ways that we could think about a rate of change. One way we could think about it is the actual calculation of slope. Yeah, we could say, well, if I have 2 points on the plane, I could actually do the math. I could say, well, that's something like y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. This is one way to calculate slope. Another way would be to say, well, if I'm subtracting the difference in the y values, like I'm doing right here, and I'm subtracting the difference of the x values, like I'm doing right here, then that's going to give me something like rise over run, my vertical displacement over my horizontal displacement. I could also think about this as the change in y over change in x. That would be another way I could think of slope. A bunch of different ways of thinking about it. What you want to make sure is that you have a hard and fast way of calculating slope that will never fail. So if you are comfortable with thinking of slope in one of these ways, think about how you can apply that to some of these others. How could you think rise over run and think y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, or change in y over change in x? Now that's the m part of our y equals mx plus b. What is the b part of y equals mx plus b? What's the other one we got over there? All right, so Our B is going to be our y-intercept. And if we think of y-intercept, we know that this is going to be, of course, it intercepts the y-axis. But we know something else about the y-intercept. What is the x value? Always going to be of the y-intercept. So if there's my y-intercept, what is my x value? This always occurs where an x equals 0. So the y-intercept is always 0, b. Now we look at this on the graph and we can say like, well, of course that's the case. However, it's surprising how often this information right here, like this is the extra point that you need. And yet if we don't think of the y-intercept as a point on the plane, sometimes we forget that we actually know the x-coordinate of the y-intercept as well. So utilize this information, particularly when you start looking at some of those more complex problems that start asking you a lot about the y-intercept. Let's take a look at a couple of questions now that are putting our linear equations into the coordinate plane. Let's take a look at this one here. Which of the following shows the graph of our front equation right here? Now, this is going to be a fantastic question for strategic elimination, and that's because we were given the equation of the line. So we're going to be able to use the components of this to help quickly get rid of some of our answer choices. Let's take a look first at the y-intercept value. So here I can see that my b value is 7. I want you to tell me in the chat which of these answer choices are we eliminating because we do not have a positive y-intercept. Yeah, you guys are on top of this. This is answer choice D. Get rid of it. That is there. And then we're going to take a look at the slope. Yep. Our slope here is positive 4. This is going to allow us to get rid of any of those with a negative slope. So see you later, B. See you later, C. Both of those have negative slopes. And we're going to quickly and confidently circle answer choice A for another point in the books. Looking at that poll results, yeah, you guys are just rocking and rolling through this one right here. Answer choice A for the win. Let's go ahead and get a nice big gold star up here. Now, I think some of you might have been thinking this one was a little bit too straightforward. Let's bump it up a notch. Let's bump it up a notch. All right. Whew. Bumping it up in all sorts of ways. We got all sorts of text. We got all sorts of graphs. We got a lot of stuff going on here. Jacques Charles, I want you to tell me in the chat, how much do we care about Jacques Charles, the French scientist? Now, I don't want in any way to diminish Jacques Charles's work. I'm sure it is exceptionally important. Charles' Law, all these wonderful things. However, that is not the point of the PSAT math questions. The point of the PSAT math question is to go and get straight to the point. So the first thing we want to do, we want to zoom in on the question. Boom, we're going right to the end. If T is the temperature of the gas in Celsius and V is the volume in liters, which of the following could produce the graph shown? We needed none of this. Sorry, Jacques. Sorry, Charles Law. I mean, I guess if you have finished every other single question on the PSAT and your choices are like twiddle your thumbs or come back to this question and read a little bit of Jacques Charles's biography, you have that as an option. But notice how we just cut the fluff. We went straight to the answer. So we really just want to know which of these lines is going to match up on the graph. Now, tell me in the chat, if we look at our answer choices, what's different about options A, B, C, and D? What is going to be the big determining factor between which answer choice we choose? Yeah, I see Dustin says we only need to look here at the y-intercept. We do. That's the only thing that's different. We match everything else up. B is our y-axis. Perfect. We see that T is our x value. They're on the x-axis. Perfect. The slopes are the same, so we can't do anything about that. Fantastic. And so we're like, oh, I know this. I'm just going to look right here where the graph like stops, and I'm going to circle answer choice D, which I see a lot of us doing, and I'm going to fall into a big old trap. Because what's the one thing we know that is always, always true of the y-intercept? We talked about it just a little bit ago. The one thing we know about the y-intercept is that it's always at 0, b. Uh-oh. We have a problem because if we look right here, this is not when x equals 0. This is when x equals -300. So if we were thinking, I'm so clever, I'm just going to extend my line out like this, which by the way may be something useful to do for another question, but not for this one, because notice how this is not 0. 0 actually appears all the way over here. This is the x-axis. What they've done here is you have shifted everything over. Here's my y-axis right there. This is where our coordinate plane is. And so now if we look back at our graph here, and I'm seeing that light bulb go off, I'm seeing that pole like shift on over to answer choice C. Yeah, you guys got it, because this is the y-intercept right here. The y-intercept occurs when x equals 0. And the value of x equals 0 is y equals 1. And that is going to match up with answer choice C. Now, I know this question caught a lot of us. And you know what? I think that is a fantastic thing. What I like to say here is that mistakes today are points on test day. This is the absolute best place to have fallen into this trap, because now you know what to look for. I want you to tell me in the chat, even if you got this question correct. I think we can all have a good takeaway from this. What is this question teaching us to do? Whenever we see a graph, particularly whenever we see data like this presented to us, whether it's in a graph form, whether it's in a scatter plot, we first don't want to rush. We never want to make any assumptions. So I see some of you are like, oh my gosh, I answered this way too fast. I just assumed I knew what the question was going to ask of me. Yeah, we want to slow down and always make sure that you check the units of measurement on your axes. Because here, if we were like, oh, I'm actually going to look at the x-axis, we can see that the x-axis is negative down here, and then we have 100 unit intervals, but it's 0 right there. So always, always, always check your axes. That is the takeaway from this question. And you know what? If it caught you today, fantastic. I'm going to say, good. We're so glad that you made this mistake now when it didn't matter, so that you can apply this and learn from it, and you won't get caught with this type of question going forward. So good work, guys, on question number 4, climbing back out of that trap. Okay. Now let's put 2 of these linear equations together, and we've got a couple different ways of solving what we call systems of equations. We can use substitution, or we can use combination. And for many of you, you may have been told that the combination is also called the elimination method. 2 names, same idea. I want you to tell me in the chat, which method are you most comfortable with? Are you a substitution aficionado? Are you a combination elimination fiend? Which are you most comfortable with? Many students tend to be comfortable or more comfortable with the substitution method. And if you are, you're not alone. If you are a fan of combination, we're going to talk about why that's actually a good thing to be a fan of. But if you are a fan of substitution, it's okay. It will get you the right answer on test day. You can use substitution. The problem is substitution tends to be the long way around, because let's take a look. If we had to find y in these sets of equations, to substitute, I'd have to isolate x from one of the equations. And this seems to be the simplest one, so I could isolate x. Now I'm going to have to substitute, that's where it gets the name from, this back in for x in my second equation. Now I have to distribute, I have to combine my like terms, I have to divide by 3 to both sides, and I got y equals -7, which is correct. So you did get the right answer. You were accurate on this question if you were to use substitution. But let's talk about combination for a minute. And it's called elimination as kind of its AKA, combo elimination, for a reason. If I want to combine these two, I'm going to get rid of my x's. So what I can do is I can multiply one of the equations by some constant so that my x's line up. In this case, I could multiply that first equation by -3, and then I could just add it to the second equation. My x's cancel out. My y's, I get -3y equals 21, divide by -3, bada bing, bada boom. Notice how I ended up in the exact same place. But why would we prefer combination? Why is combination advantageous to you on test day? It gives you a big boost that substitution does not. And yes, this is because it is so time friendly. Notice how Penny says combination is beautiful. It is a beautiful thing. And we're going to see a couple questions where it is very valuable because there are some questions that are, most all questions are faster with combination. Some questions are like infinitely easier with combination as well. So it's really a 2-for-1 benefit there. You make life easier and you go faster. Why would you not love that? Yeah, it is way quicker. So let's take a look at a sample question here. And even if you love substitution, I'm gonna push you into combination elimination territory because I really want you to practice this, and that's how we're going to quickly and efficiently use the best strategy to answer this question. So my question is the values of A and B. Okay, now with combination, we can solve for one variable at a time. Now, because this question asks me for the value of A and B, it may seem like it doesn't matter which one we eliminate. And in theory, it doesn't. But, it's always a but. I want you to take a look at our answer choices. And I want you to tell me, if you were being a really strategic test taker, which variable would you solve for first? And if you want to, you can tell us why. Because I'm going to argue that in this question, A and B are not created equally. Notice how our A values, and I'm seeing a lot of people are really liking B, but I want you to take a look at what we have here with our A values. Notice how every single one of our A value answer choices are completely different. Whereas over here, we've got two of these both have the same value for B, like B and D both have 1. So if we were to solve for B first, we'd still have more work to do. We'd have to plug B back in and then solve for A. If we solve for A, the moment we have a value for A, we are done. So that's how we're going to approach this question. We are going to solve for A. So let's line them up. Here we go. And I want you to tell me in the chat, now that we are solving for A, this means I want to eliminate my B's. So what can I multiply by to get rid of my B terms? I'm going to multiply this lower equation down here. Let's multiply that by a 3. Now you can also multiply it by a -3. So if you multiply it by a -3, you'll always add. If you multiply it by a +3, you'll then have to think a moment and say, all right, do I add or do I subtract? Both ways are fine. Some of you have probably learned one way, some of you probably learned the other. The key here is just to be consistent and not to get the sign backwards. So we're going to multiply by -3, and then we're going to add these together. And now we can see that A equals 4. Because we strategically solve for A, we are done. Answer choice B, don't have to do any more work here. And I see that is overwhelmingly the answer that we were favoring there in the poll. Nice work. If you did this with substitution, or if you did this problem and solved for B first, what I want you to think about is, okay, good, I got the right answer. What could I have done to have gotten the answer more efficiently? Which may have been solving for the other variable, or of course, if you substituted, it very likely could have been to use the combination elimination method. And let's take a look at another reason why this combo elimination method is so useful. It's when we have multiple equations that have a particular relationship. We're not going to be able to substitute to solve for a relationship, but we can use this process of making one equation look like another equation to help inform us of the relationships different lines have. Let's talk about two parallel lines. I want you to tell me in the chat, parallel lines, what do we know about them? What is the relationship between two parallel lines? Well, one thing I actually have up on the slide here, so I guess I'm kind of giving it away. Parallel lines have no solution. They are never going to intersect. And they're never going to intersect because their slopes are the same. So we have two lines, no points of intersection, which means no solutions, which means exact same slopes. The y-intercept can be like anything we want. I mean, you could have two parallel lines that are like, I don't know, a million points away from each other, but they're never going to intersect because these slopes are the same. They're never going to touch, and those points of touching are no solution. Now, we could have just two lines, and they're going to touch, and these are going to have one solution. This is kind of our classic systems of equation. This is what we did in that last problem. We wanted to solve for A and B. What we were really doing is solving for the values of that point right here. So when we have one solution, we're just going to use good old combination. We're going to solve for the values. There's one other relationship that we can have between two lines. Lines can intersect 0 times. They can intersect 1 time. Or they can intersect how many times? What's the only other number of intersections two lines can have? And if you're thinking something like, well, there's no way we can bend the line. If we bend the line, we no longer have a line. So the only other way we can have two lines intersect is if they are smack dab on top of each other, and we can have what we call infinitely many solutions. And we have infinitely many solutions. You might think of this as coincident lines. But in essence, like, here's our line, and so like there's my blue line, and my pink line is right on top of it. So they're just smack dab on top of each other. Now, what this means is that they are the exact same line. So the slope is the same, and the y-intercept is the same, and everything is the same. So you're going to see these questions that ask you about this relationship. If you have no solutions, this is code for they're parallel. If you see infinitely many solutions, this is code for they're the exact same line. And we're going to take a look at one of those questions in just a second. Here we go. Okay, so we look at our question here, and we're solving for the value of z, but there is one other very important piece of information that we're given that describes the relationship between these two lines. I want you to tell me in the chat, what is that super, super, super important word that we have got to take notice of, or we are just never going to be able to do this question. I think a lot of you are like, well, we just talked about this. So there you go. These have infinitely many solutions, which means that these are the exact same line. So what I need to do, if I'm going to solve for z over here, I'm going to need to make everything else look the same. All right, so let's take a look at this. If I want to make the first equation look like the second equation, what can I multiply by? What can I multiply by so that my first equation is going to look like the second? Yeah, I'm going to multiply by 40. And we can do this for a couple of ways. One way is you can say, well, what can I multiply 1/5 by to get 8? Since these are the exact same line, we can also say, what can I multiply 40 by to get 1600? Either way, we're going to multiply by 40. So now I have this as my new first equation. This is my second equation. I just moved it on down there. So my question was, what is the value of z? Well, let's take a look. If I want this to be the exact same line, then I need this to equal 5. So z has got to equal 5. Now, I see that we are leaning heavily towards answer choice B. A lot of you got this, but A is a big old trap. And while if you chose A, you are applying some good knowledge. You wouldn't have just randomly fallen into answer choice A if you hadn't noticed infinitely many solutions. So if you chose answer choice A, I want you to pat yourself on the back and I want you to say, good job, me. I noticed that infinitely many solutions meant make the variables the same. But I want you to take away from this also that all the variables have to be the same. So because 1/5 is not 8 and because 40 is not 1600, we wouldn't have been able just to look at this and say 1/6 is Z. We actually had to make all the other variables equivalent first. So do that, and then you can go back and just line up the variables, which is exactly what we did right here. All right, I think it's time for us to do a couple mixed bags of questions. We're gonna bump it up a notch and we're gonna end on these last two questions right here. So I've got another systems of equation, but tell me in the chat, what is different? What is this question asking us to do that we haven't been asked to do previously? Our question's a little bit different. It's not asking us for B, it's not asking us for C. It's asking us for the sum of B plus C. Okay. So we're asked for the sum of two equations. And again, if we think of step 2, we're thinking, all right, well, I want the sum. I've got two equations. I could, let's think of a plan. I could put these two equations together and I could solve for B and then I could plug B back in and I could solve for C and then I could add B and C together and then I could get my answer choice. And by the way, if you're thinking that, you're not incorrect. Like that will give you the right answer on test day. But again, it's going to be a really long way to go. Whenever you're asked about the value of some sum or some difference, like B plus C or some quantity, 2B minus 4C, something like that, something that's not just B or C, see if you can solve for it directly. Because take a look at what happens here. If I line up all my B values and I line up all my C values, so I'm going to take these two equations, I'm going to rearrange them so my B's on top of my C's, B's on top of B's, C's on top of C's, numbers on top of numbers. Look what happens when I just add these two equations together. Boop. Are we done? Is this what the question wanted? I wanted the value of B plus C. I solved for the value of B plus C. The answer is 27. I'm done. That's it. That's all we had to do. So this could have been an incredibly time-consuming question. If you are still trying to substitute B's back in for C's and figure out numbers, like, again, your math teachers would probably be very proud of all the additional math steps that you're doing. But on the PSAT, we want to make this as efficient as possible. So the takeaway here, when you are asked for some expression, some sum or some difference or some other quantity of these variables, look to see if you can solve for it directly. There is often a shortcut that will save you a lot of time on test day. And as we know, every second counts. So that is super valuable. I'm thinking we need to bump this up. I've been given a lot of gold stars here, guys. I think I need to bump this up to a platinum star. Yeah, a nice platinum star for some pretty darn good work on being strategic on this question. We've got one more to go, guys. Let's continue to rock this out. We're now going to look at word problems and translate these into linear equations so that we can set up our system. Okay, we read through this question and I want to know how many hot dogs and how many hamburgers. Now, let's be strategic. I need to set variables. I need to set a letter for hot dog and for hamburger. Okay. Why am I not going to choose X and Y? I'm not going to choose X and Y. Why not? What is the risk that we run by choosing X and Y? Not so much a risk, but it does set us up for a potential problem. Yeah, some of you might be thinking, well, if I choose X and Y, I have to go back and then see, okay, I solved for X. What did X represent? And as you notice for some of our answer choices here, like A and D are just opposites of each other. So if we flip the variables around on accident, we may end up with the wrong answer. Now, it's also not going to be very good if I let one of these variables represent H. Why should I not say let hamburgers equal H and hot dogs equal, I don't know, something else? Again, it's less likely that we're going to run into an issue as with our x's and y's, but I could have a mental blip and I could say, oh, I let h equal hamburgers. Wait, no, I let h equal hot dogs. As Julie says, this is going to be a lot of confusion. So I want you to tell me in the chat, which variables would you use so that there would be absolutely no confusion at all? And here's a great way to test it. If you can give me variables and I can look at them and I can say, oh, obviously that's hot dogs. Oh, obviously that's hamburgers. Then you have some pretty super sweet variables. And so take a look. I'm liking kind of what I see. I'm gonna let D for dogs and B for burgers, because there's absolutely no way that I'm gonna think that D stands for hamburgers. And there is absolutely no way that I think B stands for hot dogs. So now we've got D and B. We can go ahead and we can set up our systems of equations. So we're gonna do this by looking at the totals. Tell me in the chat, what is a total number of hot dogs and hamburgers that were sold? Total number. And I see some of you have already eliminated like answer choices B and answer choices C. I'm seeing some of you are already telling us to get rid of some of these. So total number equals how much? 27. Take a look at these answer choices. 16 plus 16 does not equal 27. 11 plus 14 does not equal 27. So by doing like very basic work, we've already eliminated 50% of our answer choices here. Now we just have to set up the rest of the equation by using the other total value. We can see that hot dogs are $3.50, so I can let this be 3.5 times D is my total price for a hot dog. Hamburgers, $5 each, so 5B. And this is going to equal our total number of revenue. So here are my two equations. Dogs plus burgers equals 27. And money from dogs plus money from burgers equals total money. Notice how all the units lined up. Item, item, total item, money, money, total money. So we've got all of our units consistent. At this point, we can now set up a systems of equation. I'm looking here in the poll. We're already like, you guys are 3 steps ahead of me here. We're going to go ahead and cancel out one of these terms. Let's cancel out the B because it's easier to multiply -5 than it is to multiply by 3.5. Don't make life harder than it has to be. When we do that, we're going to cancel out our B's. We can solve for D, and D is 11. Bada bing, bada boom, we're done because all we have to do, we've already eliminated answer choice C because it doesn't work, and we are left with answer choice D. Guys, I know I gave you that platinum star swag earlier. I think we're going to have to bump it up one more notch. We're going like diamond level awesomeness here for this great work on these systems of equations questions. We ran the whole gamut. We had some simple linear equations. We had some systems of equations. We looked at this in graphic form by taking note of the axes, and we also translated word problems into these two equations that we could simply solve. So I think a lot of you are saying that this is such a great resource. I think Sven said this. So keep using this resource. Going forward, review the Kaplan methods and strategies. Go on to, by the way, I know you're here in the PSAT Prep Live. You're in the live component. There's a lot of additional practice resources and quizzes and practice questions in that online portal at captest.com/study/PSAT. That's likely where many of you landed here to join us here today. So utilize that. Take that practice test, identify your strengths and opportunities, and keep practicing. Keep practicing those areas, these high yield question types in math. We're talking things like algebra. We're talking things like systems of equations, all the stuff that we covered here in this lesson. By the way, guys, this is the foundation of PSAT math. The math we talked about today is everything that's just going to build upon it. So build a really strong foundation. These are the most frequent question types that you are going to see on test day when it comes to math, both the calculator and the non-calculator section. And think positively. I've seen a lot of positivity in the chat. I've seen a lot of you saying like, this is awesome. Risa said this is like 1,000,000 times better than a math class. Guys, use this resource. Keep this motivation running right on into test day. I saw we got a lot of excitement here for some of these diamond stars, so I think we're going to have to end on another, we're going to do like a nested star. This is like a diamond star that has like positive energy. just like radiating from it. I think that's what we're going to have to end on here. It's like a positive radiating star. Whoop, whoop. You guys are doing awesome. All right, stick around. We're going to have a short break, in which case, if you're sticking around for the second hour of this, I want you to stand up, get away from your computer, stretch a little bit so you can come back with a fresh body, fresh mind. But at the top of the hour, we're going to be taking a look at reading comprehension. So if you're pumped about math and even more pumped about reading, I'll see you back at the top of the hour. Take care, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to PSAT Prep Live. My name is Stephanie, Kaplan instructor Stephanie, if you will, and I am joined by my fellow Kaplan colleagues, experts in their own right. We've got Boris, we've got Beth, Crystal, Michael, and Rob, and all of us are super excited to have you with us here today. In this session, we are going to be talking about some of those key strategies to help boost your reading comprehension score. Just a couple house reminders, you always have that chat over on the right side of the screen. And below here, if you scroll on down, you're going to see a poll that you can answer in. Just as a general housekeeping thing, please try to keep answers out of the chat. I'll go ahead and remind you once we look at some questions, but no spoilers, please keep all those answers there in the poll. Of course, before we take a look at our content-specific info today, let's just do a brief overview about what the PSAT is all about. The PSAT is one of the standardized tests that you are taking on your road to college. And the beautiful thing about a standardized test is that it's standardized. I'm seeing I've got a lot of you who were just with me in the last session. I'm so glad to have you back. I see lots of familiar names already here in the chat. Some of you may have already heard this, but for those of you who are just joining us, the very first section you're going to see is the reading test. And the reading test incorporates the first full hour of the test. And guys, this is the section that we are delving deep into today in this next hour of PSAT Prep Live. After the reading section, you have a 35-minute writing and language section. And these two sections together are going to give you what we call the evidence-based reading and writing score. Well, we don't call it that, but that is what it is called, so we call it that as well. And then after that, you're going to have 70 minutes of math. Add all this up, and you have a test that is just shy of 2 hours and 45 minutes long. A little bit shorter than the SAT for those of you who have or are planning to take a full SAT to use that as your college admissions test. Most of the questions here are multiple choice. If you added them all up, you'd have 139 multiple choice questions. Every single one of the reading questions that we're going to talk about today is multiple choice. Now, just for your reference, there are some fill-in-the-blank questions. We call those grid-ins, or again, they are called grid-ins. And those are going to be exclusive to the math section. So what we're going to focus on today in this last hour is that evidence-based reading and writing. And of course, math is going to be that other key content area. Now, the thing about the evidence-based reading and writing score is that it is a compilation of your performance on both the reading and the writing and language sections. So when we're talking about this, we're going to be able to see a bit of a breakdown in terms of those scores. Now, first things first, I do want to remind you that there is no wrong answer penalty. This was like the bane of everyone's existence in generations before you. Perhaps some of your older siblings or cousins told you about this wrong answer penalty, and it is no more. So what this means is that you never need to leave a question blank. You should always bubble in something for every answer. This means guess if you have to, guess if you're running out of time. And by the way, if you're making a guess, you shouldn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about what you're going to guess. So when we talk about no wrong answer penalty, when we talk about guessing, we talk about something called the letter of the day. This means go to the test with a pre-selected letter. Maybe it's A for awesome, or one of these other letters, D for I'm done with this question. But don't spend a lot of time being like, should I guess C? Should I guess B? Guys, it's a guess. Just guess and go. No reason to dwell on it. Now, when I talked about that breakdown earlier, you are going to get a breakdown when you take a practice test or when you take the real test that is from 40 on each of the reading, the writing and language, and the math. This is going to help you much more clearly identify whether your biggest strength is the reading test or whether the biggest strength is the writing and language. With math, you also get half your score coming from that math subset. So you already have a tendency to be able to look at and see where those math points are coming from. But this score from 10 to 40 will really help you differentiate between where your points are coming from in that evidence-based reading and writing section. And you can see here that you are going to get 2 scores out of 760. There's 160 on the lower end. One of those evidence-based reading and writing, the other is math. Add this up and you're going to get your PSAT score, which is out of 1520. Now 1520, a little bit of a, not the most straightforward score there, but this is because it aligns exactly 1-to-1 with the SAT. The SAT is out of 1600. 1520 just indicates that there aren't as many high difficulty questions that are in the PSAT as opposed to the SAT. So if you answered every single PSAT question correct, that would, in essence, be a score of 1520 on the SAT because you weren't given the opportunity to answer those high difficulty questions that account for those last 80 points. This also means that you can use your PSAT score as a projection, a very accurate projection, in fact, of what you would score were you to take the actual SAT on that exact same day. All right. Now, for those of you who are juniors, when you take the test, you'll also get something called a percentile ranking. This is telling where you fall relative to other juniors who took the test when you did. This is not a percentage of questions right or wrong, but rather this is a marker of how many students did you do better than. It's the percentage of students who scored less than or equal to you. And this is useful for those of you who are looking for national merit. So National Merit Scholarship Program, if you are junior, then the PSAT is also known as the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. You are, of course, welcome to take the PSAT as a sophomore or a freshman or younger than that, in fact, and you're doing it just for good practice and also because it can certainly help start your prep early. But for you juniors, if you're looking for national merit, even though it's called national, what you're really doing is you're competing against other students in your state. So National Merit takes the top 1,000 scores for each state. This gives you a total of 50,000 students, 1,000 per state. So if you're asking, like, what score do I need to get to be in National Merit? Well, it's not as easy as that because it depends on who took the test when you did, and it also depends on how everyone in your state did, as opposed to how people did nationally. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about national merit. Now, let's get into the good stuff for today. We're talking reading strategies. Here's what we're going to focus on. And by the way, this is a good time to kind of like a little bit of catharsis, a little bit of venting here. When we're talking about the reading comp, is this your favorite? Is this your favorite subject? Is this like you're like, oh my gosh, it's the bane of my existence subject? Like, give me the pulse here. Like, how are we feeling about the reading test? I gotta be honest with you. When I was in your shoes, when I was a high school student, I really did not like the reading test on these standardized tests because I felt that they were entirely subjective. I felt like I could always get it down to one answer or another answer, but then I'm like, I don't know, how can I pick between these two? And I found myself second guessing a lot, and it just really frustrated me. I gotta say that I love teaching the Kaplan method for reading comprehension because it is, in my opinion, just like the best thing ever. I mean, if you are feeling me on anything that I just said, if you're like, oh my gosh, I can never feel like I don't have enough time for the reading comprehension test, I never know what to do, I feel like I can never like figure out between these two answer choices, guys, I've got some good stuff in store for you today. I'm so excited to get to it. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the 3 types of passages that are on the PSAT reading test. It's important to know the 3 types because our approach to each of them is going to differ slightly. We are then talking Kaplan method for reading comp, and passage mapping is the name of the game. This may be a new term for you, but it will not be. By the end of today's session, you're going to know exactly what I mean by passage mapping. And we're going to talk about predicting an answer. And a lot of you really love reading, but don't like the reading section. And I completely feel ya. I mean, I liked reading in high school too. I read a lot. The reading for this is a little bit different. And that's what we're going to talk about, how we can take our love for reading, or how we can at least stay engaged if we're not super excited about whatever we're reading, so that we can master the reading content on this test. All right. So first things first, let's talk about the 3 different types of passages that you're going to see. you're going to see one US and world literature passage. This is going to be, usually if it's not US literature, it's often Brit Lit, although you may get something else that has been translated, but it tends to come from those. This is going to be a novel or a story. It's going to be often fiction. One of these passages with 9 questions. Now, you're also going to see history, social studies, and science type passages. So these are our non-fiction passages. You're going to see 2 of each. So you're going to see 2 science passages and 2 history, social studies passages. One of those 4 will be what we call a paired passage set, which means it's 2 shorter, kind of related passages that you have to, the questions pertain to either one or both of those passages. You'll see one of those paired passage sets on test day, and it's going to come either from the history, social studies, or the science passage. Now, the reason we break this up, like I said, is because our approach to each of these is going to be a little bit different. And so for those of you who are like, tell me, I can't wait to learn, I'm on the edge of my seat. I see some of that in the chat here. Here we go. Okay. PSAT reading strategies. Step 1, actively read the passage. Okay. Now, confession time. Not like in a bad way. How many of you have heard that you should read the questions first? And I want, before you say like, yes, that's me, why do people who tell you that, like, what's the strategy behind it? Because you may have heard this from teachers, you may have heard this from older siblings, well-meaning individuals. Like people who tell you read the questions first, they're not doing it to like, you know, to hurt you. There's a meaning behind it. Like what's the rationale? And a lot of you are thinking, well, if I see the questions, then I'm going to be able to know what to read for on the test. That's a good thought process. Unfortunately, as we saw, there's 9 to 10 questions for every single passage. So there's no way that you can read through 9 to 10 questions and be like, okay, I've memorized 9, 10 questions. All right, let me now go and find 9 to 10 answers in the text. Like by the time you've read those questions and by the time you've tried to memorize them, honestly, by the time you've read the 10th question, you've probably forgotten about the 3rd question. So it just becomes inefficient. It's good in theory, but it's not very good in practice. So what if I could tell you that you could know exactly what to look for in a reading passage without seeing the questions? Would that not be the most exciting thing that you have heard definitely this weekend? Like maybe all year. I don't know. But that's the beautiful thing about standardized tests is that you can know exactly what to look for. And that's because the questions ask you the same things every time. So we're going to read actively in just a bit. I'm going to tell you exactly what to look for. Now, once we've read, we're going to examine the question stem. So we read it, then we look at the question stem, and then we go find our answer. We're going to predict, and we're just going to match it up. Now, I want you to tell me here, when we talk about predicting the answer to every single question is located where? Where is the answer to every single question located? And if you're saying, in my brain, I mean, yeah, technically, yes, I guess. But the answer to every single question is located in the passage. So we're always going to be able to go back to the passage and anchor our answer with support. Okay, so read actively. I said, I can tell you, we're going to tell you exactly what to look for as we read these passages before you've even seen the question. It's amazing. It's not magic, I promise. The questions typically ask about the author's purpose, the tone, and the opinion of the author. So that's what we're going to want to focus on. We're going to think about the author and ask why. Why did the author write this? Detail, sentence, paragraph. And the lovely thing about this is that we don't have to put ourselves in the author's shoes and be like, if I was the author, what would I have done? Well, who was the author? Let me look up their biography. What was happening when they wrote this? No. We're going to be able to look at keywords. So we're going to look at these transition keywords, and these are the same type of words that you're likely already thinking about in some of your English classes. We have contrast words, we have cause and effect keywords, and we have like conclusion keywords. Those are kind of our three big categories. So we've got contrast, we've got cause effect, we have things like conclusion keywords, things like but, however, although, in spite, in fact, because, since, while, all these words. Anytime we see them, they're going to be super important. And they tell us why the author did something. The author writes, for example, because it's an example. The author writes because the author is giving us evidence for something or giving us a reason. So by looking at these transition keywords, the author is telling us why he or she has written the passage in the way he or she has. Basically, they're telling us their logic. Is the author taking a side? And if so, what is it? We want to be looking out for strongly charged, opinionated language. Now, we don't just want to focus on things like statements, I believe, or in my opinion, or I think. I mean, definitely if we see those are going to be really, really useful to us. But more importantly, we're going to have to look for other types of argumentative language. Anytime that the author strongly asserts, like, this is monumentally fantastic, or this is disastrous. Now we know that the author is taking a clear stance and having a clear opinion. And that is going to walk us, in fact, up to the tone. So if we know why the author is writing, and if we know if they're taking a side, whether they're arguing for something or whether they're supporting something or arguing against something, we in fact know the tone and purpose of that passage, and we'll be able to answer all the questions that ask about tone and purpose, which there are numerous questions that do that. So what we're looking for is we're identifying the passage type, and then we're going to grab our pencils, get that number 2, and we're going to take some notes. We're going to circle keywords. We're going to underline key phrases. We're going to talk about what makes a key phrase versus what makes just a detail phrase. And then we're going to annotate that in the text with our pencils by taking some notes. Now, the questions themselves range from general to specific. This is good for you, good news, because you know that the questions that ask you about the purpose, the big idea, the big picture, those are going to be the questions that are first. And then as you dig into the question set and get deeper and deeper into it, you're going to see questions get more specific and ask about more specific parts of the passage. Okay, so after you've done this, we're talking about the why, we're talking about transitions, we're talking about opinions, we're talking about tone, all that's going in our passage map. Then we are going to do step 2. Now we're going to look at the question step. And we're going to think about the question and say, okay, where is it directing me to go? What part of the passage should I go back and look for the answer in? And you're going to find the answer. You're going to predict the answer before you look at the answer choices. If you need to physically cover the answer choices up, physically cover the answer choices up so that you do not peek at them. Predict before you peek, because the answer is always, 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 always. You guys seeing a trend here? The answer is always in the text. There's always a place you can put your finger on and say, Stephanie, I found my answer in line 42. The answer that proves my answer choice is this word right here. If you can't do that, you don't have strong enough proof. Once you've made that prediction, lift your hand off those answer choices, match it up with the answer that matches what you predicted. Don't second guess. Don't keep reading the others. Once you found a match, circle it and move on to the next question. All right. Predicting before you peek, like I said, it's really going to help you with second guessing. If you are a second guesser, if you fall into second guess territory, you are going to love step 3, predict before you peek. So let's apply this. Are we ready to apply this? We're going to first look at a U.S. and world literature passage. And these are different because they are literature. They're fiction. The fact that it's fiction is not necessarily what makes it different. But what is different is that these are character-driven pieces. And characters have feelings. And characters have opinions. And characters have relationships with other characters. This is character analysis. So what we really want to focus on is the emotions. Guys, we're focusing on the drama. Who are these characters and what do they feel? What do they feel about each other? And how are they described by each other? That's what we're looking for. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the characters. Who are they? What do they want? And how are they described? And those are the words that we are going to circle and include in our passage map. Then we're going to think about how they interact with each other. What do they think about each other? Do they like each other? Do they not? We're looking at relationships. What do these actions tell you? What motivates a character? What do they feel about each other? And finally, are there any big themes or turning points? And what we mean here by theme, what happens throughout the passage? What is the whole passage about? Not like one paragraph or one sentence, but what's the overarching idea of the entire passage that you've just read? So let's put this into practice. Okay, now, a couple of things to point out. Here in this worked example, you see that our test expert has already given us some of the notes in the margins. So what this means we need to do is we need to go and find all the support that proves that, you know what, this is the takeaway that I should have gotten from this. So let's take a look at our first sentence here. I'm just going to highlight it. I'm not going to read it aloud to you. So feel free to just kind of take a second and look over it on your own. But what we see here is that we know this is about Mrs. H. Mrs. H had a stroke. Mrs. H is a widow. Mrs. H owned a farm. So this first two sentences is our author's description of Mrs. H. And we can look and we can see some of these strong words. We know that she revived vigorously. So we know that Mrs. H is not some frail woman, but in fact, she revived vigorously. She's got some vigor. We know that she had a stroke in the prime of her life. We know her husband died, and we know that she has Esther. Let's pause for a moment. Who is Esther? And where did we learn this information? Well, some of you are like, maybe it's her daughter? Or you're like, it's definitely her daughter. Because if we were to look up here in this introductory text, notice how we were given a pretty good overview of what's going to be discussed. We know we have a story. It's a literature passage. And we know that we're describing a visit with Mrs. H and her daughter Esther. It's very tempting to overlook this introductory piece of the text and say, I'm just going to get straight to the passage. However, notice how there's so much useful information from this introductory blurb that we wouldn't necessarily have had if we skipped over it. So now we know, all right, Esther is the daughter. Fantastic. Okay. Let's go on to the next paragraph. This time I am going to give you a little, not next paragraph, but the next little blurb here. I am going to give you some time to think about it. I'm going to be quiet. I want you to read the next 10 or so lines up to about line 20. And I want you to tell me in the chat what transition keywords or what opinionated language or what strong words are worthy of your pencil. Take a few seconds. Okay. So a couple of you are still reading, and that's fine. Keep reading. You can let me know. But we learned a couple things here. First off, right off the bat, we have this keyword but. But is a major contrast word, and so we definitely want to highlight this. This tells us that she has one good field, but in contrast to this one good field, they actually have a lot of other land, like woods and pasture and things like that. I'm seeing a lot of you talk about despair. Yes. So Esther was laughed at. So we're highlighting this because this is how other characters relate to Esther. They mocked her. They laughed at her. They thought that she was silly for thinking about sheep raising. And then when everything comes to the point of despair, she is insisting that these lambs are as good as any. And she goes and she tends them. And she succeeds. I'm seeing a couple of you. I see Jess has got a lot of those there. Nice work. So what we have here is we're using our keywords to really focus in on what matters. And we're using them to kind of help us sift through things. Okay, what's important? What's maybe less important? So they don't have a lot of good land. Esther's laughed at. Things were really desperate. But she insists that these are good, and she does it and she succeeds. And then yes, they're putting a bunch of money in the bank. Great work here. Let's take a look at our last little bit. And we can see here, based on our passage map note already, that this is Mrs. H describing her daughter. But once again, I'm going to give you a few seconds. I want you to read through, and I want you to tell me what words from the passage support Mrs. H's description of Esther. Okay, so we know that this is going to be Mrs. H's description of Esther because this is where we see Mrs. H talk. So we notice that this is in quotes, and we care about this because this is how Mrs. H relates to, or this is how she feels about her daughter. We know that it's been stubborn work. This is a very strong adjective, so we would definitely want to highlight this to ourselves. And she's worked really hard. But notice how she says she's tended me right along with the sheep. She's been good right along. So we know that Esther has been a caregiver along with the sheep to her mother. And then we also have another big keyword. It's an opinion keyword, actually. It's a word that tells us this is Mrs. H's opinion. It's a little word. It can slip right by us, but I see some of us have it. I see Zoe's got to hear should. Should. She should have been a teacher. And I'm highlighting this because this is Mrs. H's description. So Mrs. H says, it's been really hard work. She tended me all along. She's been good, but I think she should have been a teacher. And so now we know kind of what Mrs. H hoped for her daughter. Let's take a look now. Let's use our passage map as we move into some questions. And remember, the poll is below, so take a look at that poll. No answers in the chat, please. Let's keep the chat spoiler free. The main purpose of the passage, I want you to predict. This is our prediction. I want you to tell me, what did we just read about? What did you just read about? What was the overarching idea of what you just read about? And that introductory blurb tells us a little bit. Remember, we learned that this was about Mrs. H, and it was the narrator hearing Mrs. H talk about Esther on the farm. So you may have predicted something like, this is Mrs. H talking about Esther. This is Mrs. H telling the narrator who Esther is or Esther's hard work. I see Diane says it's a description of the life of a woman and her daughter. Yeah, we have basically a character description. We learn a little bit about like who Esther is and what Mrs. H thinks about Esther and what Esther has done. I want you to go ahead now and match this up. So we following our Kaplan method. We have read and actively passage mapped the passage. We read the question and made our prediction all before looking at the answer choices. Now we're just matching our prediction to an answer choice. Which of these matches up with what you had predicted? Stay close to your answer. Don't trust your prediction. I'm seeing a lot of you are saying, yep, this matches up with answer choice C, but B was a pretty big trap. So we're suggesting some of the essential attributes of a character. That character would be Esther, and we learned quite a bit about Esther. Now let's look at answer choice B to show that people's lives are determined by events beyond their control. Well, this may be a true statement in the real world, but notice how our passage map never talked about events beyond control. Notice how Mrs. H never indicated that anything was beyond their control. In fact, in some ways, quite the opposite. Mrs. H indicated that things were very desperate, but Esther took control against what her neighbors said and raised a whole bunch of sheep and turned it into something very successful. So this may be something that we think is true. Maybe it is true, but it's not what the passage is about. And we always have to anchor our answers with the passage. So we have to point to it. And if you're having trouble noticing, am I anchoring or am I using it as a springboard to think outside the box? If you ever have to argue, if you ever have to say, well, it could be, or maybe, or but what if? If you have to justify your answers with that type of language, it's unlikely that you have strong enough support. So if you're like, well, but maybe the fact that she had a stroke means that she could, so now we're really having to push it. And if you have to justify too hard, you probably don't have enough proof. All right, nice work on that one, guys. Let's take a look at question number 2. Mrs. Height's description of Esther's sheep-raising efforts in lines 20 to 25. Well, this is fantastic. We have a line reference, so we're actually going to go back to that reference. There it is. And let's focus on the language that you have, guys, this is awesome, already thought about. So some of the work here, we know that it was stubborn work, right? That she tended me right along. This is already in our passage map. Let's predict. How would we characterize Esther based on the fact that even though the work was very stubborn, she just kept on tending, kept on doing right by mom? You might say Esther's dedicated. You might say Esther's persevered. You might say that Esther never gave up. Exactly. She's hardworking. She's dedicated. She's caring. Match this up in an answer choice for me. Guys, we've got some super rock solid predictions. All we now have to do is match and go. Which of these says, you know what? Esther was really nice. She was really kind to mom. She took care of mom, and she was also determined. She's dedicated. She's hardworking. All right, now take a look at some of these. I'm seeing a lot of us are falling for some of these traps. Let's look at answer choice A. Answer choice A is a good one. A desire to succeed no matter what the cost. This phrase, no matter what the cost. So if I desire to succeed at any cost, this means that I am risking a lot, right? I don't care who I walk on. I don't care who I make mad. I don't care. I'm going to succeed no matter what. Now, Esther definitely did want to succeed, and she did succeed. We see that in the text. But we don't ever see the cost involved. We don't ever see that she, went way beyond what she should have done despite all this stuff and had to do a whole bunch of things to justify it. So A is very tempting because it has the word succeed there. And we know that Esther did ultimately succeed, but she didn't do it at no cost. She didn't say, sorry, mom, I want to succeed so bad. I'm going to leave the farm and I'm going to go become a teacher. And I'm just like, see you later. It's all about me. She actually did, in fact, have a bit of a cost there that she took into consideration, which was like mom was there on the farm and had to work despite the fact that it was quite difficult. Our answer here is answer choice D, determination in meeting difficulties. And notice how determination was something that matches up with our answer choice. So we said that Esther never gave up. We said that she persevered. We said she was hardworking. And she did actually have quite a few obstacles, right? The neighbors were laughing at her. Their land wasn't very good, but she was able to make that a success. And at no point do we see that Esther became really flustered or really irritated or really upset. And so we can call this calm determination. Notice how we can prove every element of answer choice D. We can't really prove answer choice A. It's our close but not quite answer. Use those predictions. Focus on the words that you actually underlined and circled in your passage map. And you'll notice they much closely align with answer choice D, which I see a lot of us are now much more confident about circling answer choice D than we were before. All right. Okay, let's take a look at our second passage type here. So we looked at literary fiction. Let's look at history, social studies. The history, social studies passages are different because unlike literary narrative, we have a very clearly stated topic, a well-defined scope, and a specific purpose. Many of these are primary source documents. And for those of you who may be in, again, AP history class or just a history class in general, when you look at primary source documents, you tend to see that these documents don't exist for decades, if not centuries after the fact, if they didn't have a point. So what we want to look here is, what is the point? Why is the author either writing this or giving this speech? What's the point? Why are they doing it? Now, like I say, one of these is going to be a primary source passage. And this primary source document means that it's likely to come from a little while ago. You might get something from the 20th century. You're much more likely to get something from the 19th, maybe even the 18th century. So you're going to have to deal with this antiquated language. But the good news is, this is not a vocabulary test. You don't have to know every word in the passage. You just have to know enough of the words to figure out what all the other words could probably mean. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to move over all those words that you don't know. We're going to move over all those words that haven't been used since the 18th century, and we're going to focus on the author's main idea. So some of these are going to be quite long, particularly because when we get those primary source documents, many of the authors back in the olden days weren't so keen on paragraph breaks and punctuation, much to the dismay of our English teachers everywhere. So when you see a really, really long paragraph and you're like, man, this is like words, 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 see if you can break it up into 2 or 3 margin notes. And you'll be able to do so by looking at keywords or logical transitions that the author is making, even if that's not reflected in their punctuation. Okay, so here we go. Identify the topic and scope. That's what I said. We're looking for the why. Why is the author writing this? What's the point? We're going to use topic sentences. This is the beautiful thing about nonfiction, is that nonfiction tends to have really nice topic sentences. And when topic sentences are used appropriately, they should tell us what is to come in that paragraph. So we can, in fact, anticipate what's to come and use that topic sentence as the basis of our margin note even before we've read the rest of the paragraph. We're then going to take a look and say, all right, so does it support? Does it question? Is it providing a new claim? Like, how does it relate to earlier paragraphs? And finally, we're going to summarize the purpose, and we're going to be able to use an infinitive. This is to inform, to refute, to argue, to promote, to explore, to discuss, to whatever it is. That's going to give you a very clear sense of the tone as well as the author's purpose. All right, now I know it can be tempting, particularly when we have these really, really dense passages, to want to go back and to sift through and to be like, okay, did I completely understand every single word? But remember, you don't have to understand every single word. You just have to understand the big picture. Why is the author doing this? What's the author's point of view? What's the tone? And that's going to be enough. So avoid this temptation. If you need to go back to read something, once a question asks for it, do so. But otherwise, don't waste your time getting bogged down in a whole bunch of different difficult details that aren't, in fact, relevant at all. Okay, so let's look at another passage. This is a worked example of a history of social studies passage, and we know that for a couple of reasons. One, we see this as an autobiography, so we know social studies. We also see that this is by Booker T. Washington, so if we are familiar with who this author is, then we also know that this is going to be a historical primary source document as opposed to something that is current. Okay, so let's take this. Again, I'm going to break it down one sentence at a time. Let's look at this first sentence. And I want you to tell me in the chat, what keywords do we see that indicate to us that the author believes something might happen? What are the keyword clues? The language that says this author believes something might happen. There might be an outcome. Well, part of us, we've got this really nice phrase that my own belief is. So we know that the author is taking an opinion like right away, my belief. And we also have a lot of words that indicate something in the future. Time will come. It will be accorded. African Americans will be accorded political rights. So the author is taking an opinion, and the author's opinion is that something is about to happen. The time is going to come. The time will come. Once more, let's take a look now at our next sentence. And again, I want us to focus on those key words. This time we have a contrast or a couple contrast keywords. Those contrast keywords are going to quickly tell us exactly what matters and exactly what to focus on. Now, again, we have this I think right up front. I think, though. But we also have another really important contrast word, and that's right here. This is our but. So we want to think, all right, if I've got a contrast word, what's being contrasted? And notice that the contrast is between the two ways this change could come about. It's not going to be through force. Booker T. Washington says, he says not force, but instead it will be accorded by people themselves, by white people themselves, when they protect the exercise of those rights. So we see it's not force, it's this other outcome that's going to enact this change. It's just going to be given when people decide to protect those rights. And finally, let's look at our last sentence here. Again, we see this forced. As soon as people in the South get over this feeling of being forced, do I believe the change will happen? When we see an author repeat him or herself like this, notice how both of these sentences in essence say the exact same thing. We know that this is definitely something we want to pay attention to because this is in fact the main idea. So we could say that the main idea here is that Booker T. Washington thinks that change will come as soon as people in the South do not feel forced. All right, let's take a look now at our questions. So this passage can best be described as, once again, I want you to make those predictions before answering in the poll. So go ahead, tell me your predictions here in the chat. What did we just read about? What's the main idea? Well, we know this passage was an autobiography. So we got someone's opinion. We got the author's opinion. And what was the author's opinion? That's the other part of our prediction. So we might predict here that I read about Booker T. Washington telling me that he thinks change will come or that a change will happen. And now I want to say, all right, let's match this up with an answer choice. So let's take it to the poll. Which of these matches up with your prediction? Change will happen. Booker T. Washington thinks that change is coming. Booker T. Washington is optimistic that change is coming. Well, only one of these are talking about something changing, and that's the one that's going to match up best with our answer choice. So this one here is going to match up with answer choice D, a statement of belief. Remember, this was Booker T. Washington. I believe, I think, it is my opinion that, lots of keywords for a statement of belief about society and how it will change. And this matches up with the other half. Change will happen. Super good work on this one, guys. We're going to have to get a giant gold star for great work using those predictions to help you answer a good reading comprehension question with confidence. Let's keep it rolling into question number 4. According to passage 4, the political rights mentioned in line 4, well, again, we have this line reference, so we're going to go right back through it, will come about through what? What is going to create this change? Or, because the author talks a lot about what's not going to, what is not going to bring about this change? Well, we saw this in a couple of places. The author thinks that force is not going to bring about this change. So in some ways, our prediction could be it's going to come about through not force. Now, that might not sound like a great sentence to us, but your predictions don't have to be like super fantastic sentences. Your predictions just have to be something to help you match up an answer choice. So we know that this is going to come about when the South no longer feels forced, or when there is no force. Again, poll is below. Go ahead, start answering in the poll. I see Lauren saying not in a way of force a while ago. Fantastic prediction. Let's match it up. So here in answer choice A, increased political pressure. That to me sounds a lot like force. Out of there. Additional laws. Laws sound like being forced, do they not? If I make a law, are you forced to abide by it? You absolutely are. I see a lot of us falling for these traps here. Peer pressure. Is peer pressure forcing? Yeah, peer pressure is also another type of force. I see we're shifting, we're thinking. We've only got one left, a natural evolution of society. Now, notice how nowhere in the text did Booker T. Washington say, change is going to come about when there is a natural evolution of society. but we were able to put our finger on the fact, like the proof, the evidence that Booker T. Washington thinks this is not going to happen as long as people feel forced. And we can eliminate because A, B, and C are forced. Look at what one of your colleagues, E4 boards, A, force, B, force, C, force, D, not force. And not force for the win, because not force is what we predicted when we used our proof. All right, guys, we've got one final type of passage type that you're going to see on the PSAT. Those are your science passages. Now, here's the great thing about science passages. First off, some of you probably really like science, and you're like, yes, I love the science passages. The science passages are awesome. They're the coolest. I learned so many fun facts. And here's the thing. If you like science passages for those reasons, cyber high five. That is awesome. For those of you who are like, ew, no, I don't like the science passages, here's the reason you should also like science passages, or the reason you can also like science passages. I don't want to say that you should, but you can. Because science passages are fact-oriented. Science passages are like topic, sentence, fact, fact, fact. Topic, sentence, fact, fact, fact. Topic, sentence, fact, transition word, fact, transition word, other fact. Topic, sentence, fact, fact, fact. Like they are so consistent with how they present information to you that even though you might not find them very exciting, you should definitely get excited about how consistently organized they are. Now, some reasons that they can be challenging, well, they do contain a lot of jargon and technical terms that you might not be aware of, but no big deal, because just like the antiquated language in history, social studies, you don't have to know what these words mean. You just have to know what all the words around them mean. And I'm seeing a lot of science love in the chat, and that is super awesome. If you know some of these science and technical terms, even better. But if you don't, no sweat, because you're not going to be asked to have to like articulate what's going on scientifically. You just have to be able to find usually things like evidence, cause and effect, those types of relationships. So in order to answer these, look for that central idea. Thesis statement for the win. It's often there in the first paragraph. Underline it. That is now your main idea. And now you're looking at how each paragraph, and by paragraph, remember we're saying like topic sentence, passage mapping is an anticipatory exercise. You see the topic sentence and you're like, self, what's going to come next? Topic sentence says, this paragraph is about birds. All right. Transition word, however, says, contrast is coming up. Let me find the transition. So let me find that contrast. You're thinking ahead, anticipating what comes next. And when you see those topic sentences, you're going to ask yourself, all right, how do these relate to my thesis? Is it explaining? Is it supporting? Is it contradicting? Is it summarizing? Is it shifting focus? Is it telling me something new? What's it doing? How does it relate? Very, very linear. And we're not going to get distracted by all these technical terms because one, they're not going to be tested. Two, if you have to know them, there's going to be a footnote in there. So also, I'm going to give like 3, don't waste time pronouncing them. Like if you don't know how to pronounce a word on the PSAT, who cares? It's not a verbal, like you don't have to read the test aloud. So don't waste time being like Mecca, Lipa, just be like M. Move on, because no one's going to care if you know how to pronounce it or not. And don't waste your time, even mental pronunciation. So there's going to be one theory or idea, stick it in your passage map. That's going to be the big picture that takes you home all the way to the questions. Let's take a look at these questions, by the way. All right, so we know we're going to learn about lunar eclipses. Just based on this note, an essay about the characteristics of lunar eclipses. What is our tone going to be? Is this going to be argumentative? Is this going to be informative? Is this going to be someone like refuting that lunar eclipses are cool? Yeah, this is going to be very neutral. There's a neutral tone. It's going to be informative. It doesn't mean that we might not have like positive things here, but it's largely going to be like, here's some things, the characteristics of lunar eclipses. Let's take a look at our first sentence. And I want you to tell me in the chat, if you could only pick out one word, only one, I only give you one word. It is the most important word of this topic sentence. It's the most important word of any sentence that it's in, not just this sentence. The most important word of any sentence. What word would that be? I know we're tempted to say things like eclipses, solar versus lunar because we know that this passage is about eclipses and solar versus lunar. But how did you know it was about solar versus lunar? No, you guys, but small word, big impact. This is the most important word here because now we know we are comparing solar eclipses versus lunar eclipses. And the author's saying people know about solar eclipses, people don't know how awesome lunar eclipses are. And I said now says lunar eclipses are almost as good as dinosaurs. Oh man, I love dinosaurs. I like lunar eclipses too though. Bit of a science nerd here. All right, guys, let's keep going. Let's move down to this next section of our passage. Now, we've got a lot of details here. I don't want to know all these details. I just want to know, what are all these details about? All these details, what do they have in common? Filtering, reflection of light, color effects, light shows, dust and clouds. What do all these have in common? There's a couple ways we could say it. We could say this is like how we see the lunar eclipse for what it is, like why the lunar eclipse looks the way it does. We could say this is about the color of the lunar eclipse. We could say that this is about like how the light of the lunar eclipse makes us see it. But something about this. This is about the light, the colors, light, color, the what we see, and like why we see what we see. Like that's what we're getting right here. Okay. Now let's take a look at our last couple of lines here. We've got a couple other big keywords coming in. We have while. So brain says, look for the contrast. While solar eclipses are only a few minutes, lunar eclipses can last for several hours. Okay, another difference between the two. And now we have another keyword. In fact, the beauty of them makes them a favorite. Notice how many of you said earlier this was an informative passage, and you're absolutely right. Informative passages have this neutral tone. Even though we have very positive language, it's a favorite of amateurs. The author, him or herself, is staying relatively objective. The author is just telling us that other people like this. And let's take a look at our last sentence, or I'm sorry, our last paragraph here. And again, take a moment or two to read it, and I want you to tell me, what is all this about? What ties all these details together? All these details. Well, first off, we've got a really big transition word that we just have to circle. I can't help myself. We have got to circle this, however. Notice how we have a whole ton of facts. Lunar eclipses occur 200 times a year. Here's the moon. Here's the earth. Here's how they're positioned. This is just telling us like how the lunar eclipse is, or like what the lunar eclipse is. It's telling us how it all works. So this is like the how, the process, how lunar eclipses occur and when. Yeah, exactly. This is like the how of the lunar eclipses. And so that's what I'm going to put here in the passage because I don't want to focus on all the facts. I just want to focus on the big picture. I'm seeing a lot of you are like, yes, that's what I said. Awesome. All right, on to the questions. According to the passage, the colors of a lunar eclipse result from what? No spoilers in the chat, please. Tell me in the poll. Make your prediction. If you want to put something in the chat, you can tell me a line reference. Well, where did we talk about colors? First paragraph. Let's go back and find it. And we see the filtering of reflection of light from the Earth's atmosphere creates color effects. Notice how we already have this in our passage map. Our passage map says something like how we see it, why it looks the way it does, what the colors are doing. Let's match this up. Guys, we put our finger on the answer. When you see according to the passage, this really means go find it. Go put your finger on it. Let's match it up with an answer choice. We found a sentence that flat out said, colors are the result of filtering and refraction. Guys, it's really going to be hard to choose anything. We got one of these right here. Answer choice C. Now, stability of lunar eclipses is also, I'm seeing we're getting a couple votes for B. Remember, we want to go back and utilize the text as it states. With this one here, we see that verb it creates, a very clear cause and effect in the text from it is the light of filtering and refraction that creates the colors. And that matches right up with answer choice C. Guys, we did so good on this one. I did a gold star earlier. Again, I've got this progression of stars for us. I think we're going to bump, you know what, since this is like lunar eclipses, let's get like a really cool like blood moon color star. Did you guys see that one? Yeah, let's do that one here for that very fancy type of lunar eclipse. One more question coming at you guys. Let's take a look at question number 6. In lines 26 to 27, the phrase pair of nested cones serves 2. Now this phrase serves 2 tells us that we want to ask ourselves, why did the author talk about this nested cone business? And we got a line reference, which is fantastic. So let's go back to the line reference. And now let's predict, why did the author tell us it's about nested cones? Well, once again, we don't have to just imagine what the author was thinking. We actually have some very specific words that we can look at to say exactly why the author uses this. The author tells us that he or she uses it so that we can understand the process better. To understand the process better, it's helpful to imagine this nested cone thing. All right, so here's our prediction. Our prediction is the author gave us this so that we could understand and imagine it. Match it up with an answer choice, folks. I love what Lauren is saying. I didn't realize how easy it is to find the answer when you predict it first. Isn't the Kaplan method for reading comp like super awesome? And you never have to second guess yourself. You're like, there's my proof. I just answered the question. Now I just have to match it up. The answer's always there for you. As we are looking for an answer that says this is helpful to imagine. All right, we're a little torn on this one. So describe the diffraction of light through the atmosphere. Well, that doesn't match up with help us understand. Explain why lunar eclipses are a favorite of photographers. Well, we learned that this is a fact. The author does tell us that lunar eclipses are a favorite of photographers, but this is in paragraph 1. The author says it's all these colors of light and diffraction and all that jazz. That's why people like it so much. This line was in paragraph 2. Paragraph 2 is talking about how these whole things work, how the lunar eclipse happens, and that matches up with answer choice D, a concrete example to help visualize. Notice how help visualize matches up very clearly with our prediction of to help us understand, to help us imagine the process of how it was happening that the author was discussing. Guys, I could not be more pleased with you. If I could try, let's get another, we're gonna have to get like a big, like cobalt blue, like night sky color star here. Oh my goodness, I am so glad that so many of you are finding this helpful. Guys, I wanna close on this. We've done a lot, but your work is not over. You have a lot more resources available to you in your PSAT Prep Live online portal. That's at captest.com/study/PSAT. So take a look at it. Do practice tests. Identify your strengths and areas of opportunities. Practice, 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 practice. Passage mapping is amazing. I love it. You love it. I'm seeing so much love for it here, and I've seen so much love for it today. But you must continue to practice on your own. Use those reading passages on the website. Look at additional passages. Practice passage mapping, just everything you read for school. It's a great way to help you annotate and a great way to help you understand dense passages, even if they're not PSAT passages, even if they're just assigned for a class. And think positively. You guys have done a fantastic job. I'm seeing so many light bulb moments that we happened today. I'm so excited for all of you. And keep it up. We've got lots of additional PSAT Prep Live offerings coming up for you. Guys, it has been such a pleasure. I just want to point out what's coming up tomorrow. Tomorrow we have Boris. He's going to be with you talking about math in terms of rates, ratios, and more. And then he's going to be taking a look at writing and language strategies. I'm going to be back with you tomorrow. I'm going to be off camera helping you out in the chat. We would love to see you come. I'm so thrilled to see so many of you here, guys. And I can't wait to see you back. Have a good one, everyone. Take care.